You already did some questions on page 83 for today. Let's get that out, and we'll go over that together. We'll check that. We're going to check this for a grade. So check them carefully. Content questions, page 83. The first question had to do with comparing low church and high church Anglicans and contrasting that with them with the Puritans and the low church Anglicans. It probably was written in a number of your books to make a chart. I think that's the easiest way to do it. If you did that, you could have all three side by side to compare and contrast. So let me just give you what you should have there, and then you can ask me questions about what you have is correct. The low church Anglicans were strong Protestants who believed that the ceremonies and practices of the Anglican Church are matters of indifference. So in other words, the practice of the church, the ceremonies, don't really matter, as long as the church is doctrinally sound. So the ceremonies don't matter, the doctrine is important. That, you should have that somewhere concerning the low church. The high church Anglicans were the opposite. They said the ceremonies and practices were divinely ordained. So the ceremonies are of extreme importance, but doctrine doesn't really matter that much. Their view of doctrine was more liberal. All right, we're doing okay so far? And then when you compare those or contrast those with the Puritans were doctrinally closer to the low church Anglicans. They felt doctrine was important, but they wanted to eliminate the church practices because they believed that they were Roman Catholic practices and ceremonies that were being conducted in the church. So, low church Anglicans, ceremonies are unimportant, doctrine is really important. High church Anglicans, the doctrine is unimportant, the ceremonies are really what's important. The Puritans, the doctrine is really important, and we need to get rid of the ceremonies because they're Roman Catholic. All right, any questions about what you have? Did you all get that? Any questions? So there would be a total of 6 points on that, 2 points for each of the positions, and what they felt about doctrine, what they felt about ceremonies, essentially. All right, no questions. We'll go on to number 2. Why was the halfway covenant dangerous to the Congregationalist churches in New England? What do you say about that, Sally?
The baptism is supposed to be for those who have accepted Christ, and the halfway covenant gives people that feel secure because they're baptized, so it's because they didn't really have to confess that they didn't do it in
Yeah. Now that would be true across the board for all churches that baptize infants. That could be an argument that you might make against infant baptism, but it doesn't directly address the halfway covenant. So, Sarah, what do you have?
I said that it was originally meant to keep the people in the church, and there's some preaching that ended up having an increase in the number of unconverted church members.
Exactly. It increased the number of unconverted or unregenerate church members. Any question? All right, number 3. I asked you to list 3 things that the Quakers opposed. 3 things that they opposed. So what do you have there, Lydia?
Participating in war, taking oaths, and holding political office.
Good. Those are 3 things. Anybody have anything different? Okay. Well, those are 3 things they actively opposed. You might have put down things they didn't practice. Anybody put things down that they didn't practice in their churches? Okay, everybody had the 3 things. Okay,
I put that down originally, but then I went back and saw what you wrote. Like, you told us to write down what was opposed, so I just got rid of that.
Okay.
So I had both. But
all right, so the things that they did not include in their church churches were the ordinances, that is baptism and the Lord's Supper. So if you had that, we'll accept it, but that, what they opposed is what was already mentioned. It looks like all of you had that. Any questions? 3 points on that for getting all three of those. Number 4, list the order of a typical service in a colonial church, and I said to put 4 elements. Let me just give you that because there might be confusion about one of the things. You could have said, first of all, that there was a drum or a bell that called members to the service. Now that really technically wouldn't be part of the service, but if you put that, we'll take it. Anybody have that? The drum or the bell? Okay. Secondly, was the pastor's prayer. At the early part of the service, there was the pastor's prayer. Then there was the reading of the Bible. And then there was singing. And then the main part of the service was the sermon. So the 4 parts that were actually part of the service were the pastor's prayer, reading the Bible, singing, and sermon. 4 points for that. Any question? All right. I'm hoping the lack of questions means that you had these. Number 5, in what ways were the mission work of John Eliot and David Zeisberger similar? Now, because it says ways, how many should we expect to have as a minimum? 2. All right, so this is worth 2 points. Tell me one thing. You could have had several different things. What's one thing that they had in common? Joey?
They reached out to different nationalities.
Particularly the Indians. So we ought to say that. But that's fine. But if you had Indians, that would be the same thing. Michaela?
I know they both gave them works in their own language.
Okay. Any others? You could, Alex, you have another one?
I said they tried to convert like preachers.
They tried to convert preachers?
Yeah,
What do you mean?
like the pastors that were constructions and
I'm not sure that fits into their mission work. Is that one of your 2?
yeah.
All right, I'll give you that, although I'm not sure that really fits in as well, because we're really talking about their work out to as missionaries. You could have also said that they established settlements of converted Indians. So those that were being saved, they sometimes took and settled in a different location. And you could have said that they both saw their work undone by prejudices and fears created by wars between settlers and the Indians. All right, so it sounds like most of you got those 2 things. And then your book gives you 5 results of the Great Awakening. I'm going to give you my list later. It'll be a little bit different. But 5 specific results of the Great Awakening. Give me one, Haley.
Right, church group.
All right, church growth, or growth of church membership. Give me another one, Stephen.
Religious colleges increased.
Right. Give me another one. Haley.
It transformed the spiritual life of churches.
Okay. Give me another one.
Brought division to American churches.
Brought what?
Division.
Oh, division. Yes. Okay. Michaela?
I have that it promoted unity of churches.
Okay, so both division and unity, depending on which side you're on. Okay. Any others? Alex?
more personal liberties.
More personal liberties. What do you mean?
Like their own their relationship with them.
As opposed to what? I'm not sure I understand exactly what you're saying was the result of the Great Awakening that have brought more personal liberties. I mean, does anybody have something similar to that you can explain, Jessica?
I think when you look at something about, like right after you said, the ability to break through for personal and inspiring American democracy, it's more political.
Okay. So it inspired in people a greater sense of personal responsibility and personal freedom, which then affected how they viewed politics as well as spiritual things, because they had a sense that they were personally responsible to God, and had a personal relationship with God, that therefore they were personally responsible for their government and had a relationship with their government as well. They're important as an individual to God. They were important as an individual in the state of the colony government. All right. Any others? Michaela?
And learn how the church is required for some generation for membership.
You're saying what churches?
Just churches in general.
There were, okay, church in general were requiring regeneration for membership.
Like they got rid of Catholic covenants.
Yeah. Okay. Devin,
Democratic influence left in the churches.
meaning what?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, that would go along with the sense of equality that people were gaining, were equal before God, were equal in our churches as well. So we should have more voice in our churches, not just be told what to do top down. Okay, Sophia?
I have, it was the first true national movement.
I'm not sure we can say that's a result, that's an observation, but not something that you can say, well, because of the Great Awakening, this occurred. You're really describing the Great Awakening, so that can't count as a result. Any others? All right, let me give you a few more that your book has. Okay, repudiation of the halfway covenant was mentioned in the context of a different one, but you could have had that separately. An added sense of nationhood, that we're all part of one people here, not just Georgians and Pennsylvanians, but we're part of one nation. And that was largely because of George Whitefield, because of his connection with everybody, traveling all over the country, brought that about. Increased stress on missions, no one mentioned. I don't believe. Okay, and we'll talk more about this in a few minutes as I give you my results of the Great Awakening. May differ a little bit from your book, and centers in on certain ones. Okay, so there are 5 points on number 6. That leaves 21 points altogether. So count up how many points you have off, put it at the top, circle it. And I will collect them. Yes.
I was looking at through it and I'm wondering about the question. I have high church completely agreed with the Anglican church, but low church agreed doctrine and Puritans. But they like
It's just wasting.
Okay, you really don't have the high.
I mean, it's not
Church.
wasting more paper.
You don't really make a difference in high church and low church. You say high church agreed with the Anglicans. Well, low church did. And they're both Anglicans.
I said
So-
low church agreed with doctrine of Puritans.
No, they didn't. The low church were willing to put up with the ceremonies. But the high church said the ceremonies are what were given by God. So there's a big difference between their attitude toward the ceremonies, even though they both would allow for it, you could say. So I would say since you really don't have a difference between them there, you're going to lose a point on both of them. Because you, well, let's see. All right, we'll just take off 1 point for the low church because you didn't define what they thought about the ceremonies. Okay, have all your papers? Just pass them up. Okay, now in your notes you want to look at just kind of wrapping up the awakening. looking at the leaders of the awakening. Just go through, it's kind of a review, looking at who was involved. First we have William Tennant, remember him? He works largely in Pennsylvania, although his father was ministering in New Jersey, Presbyterian, and you can see some of the, I'm sorry, no, that is the father, William Tennant's father, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. I'm not sure why it says Pennsylvania. He was New Jersey, I think at least as much or more than Pennsylvania. Built a law college. Frelinghuysen actually comes before Tennant, Dutch Reformed in New Jersey, and you can see some of his biographical information. Instrumental in forming the Dutch Reformed Church in America. Jonathan Edwards certainly is stands out as the most notable person, or one of the two most notable people in the First Great Awakening in Massachusetts, Congregational, and some of the facts that we've learned about him are there. Gilbert Tennant, son of William, ministered in those two colonies, Presbyterian, and you can see he worked with Frelinghuysen, traveled with Whitefield, helped start the college in New Jersey, kind of out of the law college. Shubal Stearns, we saw in the southern colonies as a Baptist, and you can see some of his information there as well. Daniel Marshall, we talked about in the southern colonies, Baptist. Here's a guy we didn't talk about. Eleazar Wheelock was a congregational minister in Connecticut, was an associate of Jonathan Edwards, founder of Dartmouth, which was founded to train Indians as missionaries. So I think you did read about Dartmouth, the founding of Dartmouth, didn't you? Was that in your reading? Wheelock's the one who did that. Muhlenberg, you read about, he's Lutheran. Formed the first Lutheran synod in America. Samuel Blair, I'm not sure if he was in your text. Does that sound familiar? Samuel Blair? I think maybe he was mentioned at least. Presbyterian, associate of Gilbert Tennant, ministered in those two colonies. George Whitefield, of course, Anglican, worked under the Wesleys, etc., etc. And then Samuel Davies, Presbyterian in Virginia, studied under Blair. Helped found and served as president of College of New Jersey, which is Princeton as well. So he was involved in that. All right, those are just some of the people. Hopefully you recognize most of those names as having heard of them, and that's something. Okay, we're going to move next to the results of the awakening. And you have a place in your notes for that. First of all, and some of this will coincide with what's in your book, but just a little different approach in some instances. First of all, yeah, we can applaud the fact that there was an increase of new members in the churches of the colonies. Estimates of conversions conservatively are listed between 100 to 200,000. In New England, church membership increased between 30 to 40,000. Separate Baptists grew from 16 to over 36,000 in the southern colonies, creating numerous churches and associations. It does not appear to have been merely the renewal of the backslidden. So these are just not, Christians that got away from the faith and came back. The historian Sweet estimates between 30,000 to 40,000 conversions in New England, along with an increase of 150 churches. One estimate claimed 250,000 converts and 350 new churches. So, and it's really hard to get an exact number, but suffice it to say that many, many people came to the Lord and joined churches. That led to an increase, increase of new churches from 1740 to 1760 in New England. Over 150 new congregations were formed. Many Baptist and Methodist churches were created, especially in the South. Next, was an increased interest in spiritual things among Christians. So not only were people being saved, but Christians were getting renewed in a sense as well, being more concerned about spiritual things. And we can applaud that there was an increase in students to prepare for the ministry. Which leads us to the next point, and that is, in order to educate them, we can applaud the fact that there was an increase of new schools to train ministers. A long ovation for that one. New schools to train ministers. At the beginning of the awakening, there were only 3 colleges in all the colonies. What was the first college established? Harvard. Anybody know the second one?
Yale.
Yale was, I'm not sure if that was second or third, but Yale was one of the first 3. I think there was another one before that. That would be kind of the result of the awakening. William and Mary in Williamsburg. All right, those are the 3 that were in existence at the beginning of the awakening. As a result of the awakening, or during the awakening, the College of New Jersey, which was the successor of Tennant's Law College, was erected in 1746, largely through the sponsoring effort of Whitefield, and that later would become Princeton. The College of Philadelphia, 1749, came from the erecting of buildings for Whitefield, because many pulpits were closed to him during his second tour. A lot of pastors wouldn't let him come to their churches, and so people just built buildings in Philadelphia for him to have meetings. They built the buildings for that. Well, after he was no longer there, they said, okay, what are we going to do with the building? I know, let's start a college. So that's what they did. College of Philadelphia. Moore's Indian Charity School was started by Eleazar Wheelock, and that was in order to educate the Indians out there, and became Dartmouth later on. It was supported through the financial connections of Whitefield. Queens College in New York was the fruit of the revivalistic ministry of Theodore Frelinghuysen. The College of Rhode Island's first president was a Princeton graduate of 1762, and in 1804, the college changed its name to Brown University. College of Rhode Island became Brown University. Next, there was an increase. Whoops, I forgot to put up the colleges. Applause for all of them.
Yes.
Good job.
Yes.
Starting all those colleges. And then there was an increase in new denominations, as you know, especially what 2 denominations kind of got started. Maybe not totally started, but at least increased a lot. Methodists and Baptists, right? Which in turn led to more religious tolerance and religious freedom, because the state churches of several colonies weren't the only church anymore, and that eventually led to people having more openness about other churches. Theological and ecclesiastical dissension also developed in existing denominations. As you know, the divide, the divisions that took place, the new side, old side, within Presbyterianism, old light, new light, within Congregationalism. There were regular and separate Baptists, Anglicans and the Methodists. There were divisions between those different denominations, within them, I should say. There was a new stress on missions, especially to the Indians. For example, James Davenport, even though he went off the deep end in some ways, he did have mission efforts to the Indians. John Sargent, Eleazar Wheelock, David Brainerd, who is pictured here. I want to say a word about him. David Brainerd was a wonderful young man, a very Christ-centered young man, who decided that he wanted to go to minister to the Indians. He kept, as most people did back then, he kept a journal, a daily journal, a diary, and we have that today. He was slated to marry a daughter of Jonathan Edwards. But unfortunately, he died at the age of 29. One incidence of his commitment to Christ and to the Indians to whom he was ministering is given in the action of Brainerd on a winter's day as he was out in the woods between the settlement and where the Indian village was, and was praying. He was on his knees praying, and he was praying in the snow. Some Indians from that nearby village came upon him as he was out in the woods praying, and persuaded him to get up and come in the village with him. Where he had been kneeling, he had been there so long praying for these Indians that his knees had been bleeding, and there was blood in the snow. That's how committed he was to these Indians and taking the gospel to them. His gravestone says this: a faithful and laborious missionary to the Stockbridge, Delaware, and Susquehanna tribes of Indians. But his life meant much more than that. His life sacrifice reached out and touched the whole world, challenging more people into Christian service than perhaps any other man that ever lived. When your mention of the name Brainerd automatically triggers the mind to think of dedication in a way that perhaps has never been equaled. He would travel 15,000 miles on horseback. Sorry, hit the wrong button there. His journal covers from the course of 1 year, 1745 to 1776, from June to June. And as I said, that's available. Jonathan Edwards thought so much of his almost son-in-law's diary that he published it. And there is a copy on my shelf back there if you'd like to read it. I remember reading it in junior high or high school, and remember how compelling it was, how inspiring it was. John Wesley said this: let every preacher read carefully over the life of David Brainerd. And he distributed his story to all his societies. All right, so new stress on missions, including David Brainerd, also David Zeisberger, Samuel Kirkland, Jonathan Edwards also, as you remember, went out and lived near the Indians, and Christian Henry Rausch. Next there was a new stress on social activities, like abolitionism was one thing that came out of the Great Awakening. The establishment of orphanages. Remember, Whitfield was really concerned about that. Indian training schools, such as Dartmouth, and so on. So people became involved in social activities. Next, it aided in the beginnings of the American War for Independence. Now, this is something that most textbooks don't connect. My contention is that if there was no Great Awakening, there's no War for Independence. And you'll see why here. First of all, this constant applause does get annoying after a while, doesn't it? By breaking down distinctions between classes. Because during the Awakening, it didn't matter whether you were wealthy or poor. You know, as someone has said, everyone's level in front of the cross. And so it broke down class distinctions. Secondly, it broke down distinctions between denominations. People saw that God was working in multiple denominations. And so they were much more open to interacting with people of other denominations. Next, it broke down distinctions between colonies. Yeah, no applause for the denominations, I guess, but just for the colonies. Colonies, you know, were kind of proud of themselves too, and didn't want to cooperate with other colonies normally. We saw that. when we talk about the French and Indian War, you'll see that. But this awakening kind of started to break down those divisions between the colonies and saw the advantage of working together. And then, lastly, the awakening fostered principles of idealism based upon the equality of all in God's eyes. So the idea that God sees us all as equal, then maybe we all are equal in the government too. It also led to a millennial optimism. There were those, including Jonathan Edwards, that thought that this awakening was going to bring in the millennium. All right, any questions about these results? Caleb?
Well, for one of our notes, it says increase in school trained ministers, there is one, but what it was for wasn't on there. It's just trained ministers.
For various denominations. Trained ministers for various denominations. So in his book called, Paul Johnson writes, in his book called A History of the American People, says this: the Great Awakening was thus the proto-revolutionary event, the formative moment in American history preceding the political drive for independence and making it possible. Now, what lessons do we have for today? Do I have a place for lessons there? No. Let's see if I have it on slides either. Okay. All right, before we get to lessons, let's look at this. Our religious influences supporting the American Revolution. Groups who supported the revolution were the Congregationalists, primarily, Presbyterians, and these are the reasons behind it. You can glance over those. Some Anglican laymen in the southern colonies, although Anglicans in general did not, at least the church hierarchy did not, because they're tied to England. Lutherans, in fact, Wesley got a lot of heat for not supporting the American colonies. Lutherans, not very much support either. Radical dissenters, a little more support maybe than some others. But you can see they're supporting because they're afraid that Anglicans are going to establish a state church. Those who opposed, Anglican clergy opposed, as you can see there. Anglican laymen in New England and the Middle Colonies opposed the War for Independence. The radical dissenters, some of them opposed it just because of pacifism. And the Methodists opposed it because they felt, as others, that they should be submitting to the rulers and the influence of John Wesley. And we'll see that coming to play when we get to the war. Okay, now lessons for today, quickly. Number one, we may be more sophisticated today, but the depravity of man's heart is still the same. We still have the same problems because we still have the same sin nature. People in general. There may be more Christian profession today, but the church needs spiritual renewal. There may be more sermons today, but we need a return to biblical preaching. I think you would probably admit that having read the few sermons that you did, that it was very biblical oriented. It was centered on what the Bible says. We need more of that today. There may be people in church today, but the masses need to hear the gospel. We're not doing a very good job of getting the gospel out to people in general. So we have many people in this country that seriously do not know who Jesus is. And then fifthly, there may be pockets of great blessing here and there, but we need a sovereign outpouring of the Holy Spirit. And this is my continual prayer. God, bring us another awakening. Bring us another awakening. I hope you'll pray that way too. And I hope you also pray, let it begin with me. We know from history that if there's another awakening that's going to occur in our country, it's going to largely be through young people. That's how it's going to start. If history is any indication. And so we're depending on you to have that interest in God doing a great work once again. All right, any questions about the lessons for today? Anything you would add to it? This comes from John Donne, who wrote a book called The Great Evangelical Awakening of the 18th Century. He's in Australia. All right, having completed our look at the awakening and other things that happened in the religious field during the colonial period, which is essentially chapter 4 in your textbook, and of course much more notes that went along with that. We're now ready to take a test over chapter 4. So we will do that tomorrow. So if you've been looking over your materials day by day, as I have encouraged you, then you will be fine. If you have not, then you have a lot of cramming to do. Certainly, the major figures you should know, the ones that we've mentioned over and over again, you should know the phases of the awakening and the results of the awakening. So, study your notes, and we'll have a test tomorrow.